They said she was no one, a girl who smelled of wet straw and kennel muck, who had no rank, no bloodline the council would acknowledge, no name worth recording in the keep's ledger beyond the small column reserved for servants too minor to dismiss by letter. They said the 40 wolves she tended were animals following their hunger, that they obeyed her only because she held the bucket. They said that when she vanished from Vraston's walls, the pack would eat by the second morning and forget her smell by the third. They were wrong about all of it. What happened in the 9 days after Marin left the keep, and in the 3 nights that followed, would be argued over by the council elders of Vraston for a generation. What is not argued is this: a king who had not bent his knee to any living creature in 7 years crossed the floor of his own great hall and knelt on cold flagstone before a woman in a servant's tunic, and every armored lord present, every foreign duke, every robed elder dropped to their knees behind him, one after another, like candles going out in a single breath of wind. This is how it happened. The year was the 412th year of the Vraston Compact, and winter had come early and stayed cruel. Ice had locked the River Threll into a gray corridor of silence by the first week of the solstice month, and snow lay in iron-hard ridges along the outer walls of the keep, so that the stones above it looked like teeth set in pale gums. Inside those walls the fires burned high, and the smell of tallow and pine resin moved through every corridor, and in the wolf yard at the keep's eastern end, 40 large pale wolves slept in a warmth that was not entirely from the braziers. Marin had been in the wolf yard since she was 9 years old. She had not come there by choice. Her father, Cale, had been the keep's last true head wolf keeper, a man who understood the castle wolves not as weapons of the Pack King's authority, but as a living cord between the land and the throne of Vraston. When Cale died of the lung sickness in Marin's 9th year, Steward Sarath had moved quickly and quietly to erase the post and fold its duties into general kennel service, and Marin, with no other kin to claim her, had been folded in too. She had grown up in the smell of straw and wolf breath, learning what her father had known without being told she was learning it, taught instead by an elderly kennel tender named Petra, who had watched Cale work and remembered everything. Petra was perhaps 60 years old, with hands like knotted rope, and a voice that had grown permanent from a lifetime of low, calming speech. She had raised Marin the way she raised difficult wolf pups, with patience, with specific instruction, and with a refusal to lie about what was dangerous. The two of them moved through the wolf yard together each evening at the 17th bell, carrying the long-handled feeding buckets, speaking to each of the 40 wolves by the names Petra had kept in her own private record, because Sarath's official kennel ledger had stopped recording wolf names after Cale's death. Marin had memorized every name. She knew which wolves would eat from the ground and which preferred the shallow stone troughs, which ones carried old injuries that made crouching painful, which pups had been born that autumn, and still startled at sudden sound. She knew the pale female she privately called Ash tended to sleep pressed against the eastern wall with her muzzle on the boundary stone, as if keeping watch on the forest beyond. She had never thought of this as power. It was simply what she knew. If you have spent any time watching someone carry an invisible skill the world refuses to name, you know exactly what it looks like to watch Marin move through that wolf yard. Drop a comment below if you want to see where this goes. The Solstice Tithe Assembly convened on the 22nd day of the solstice month in the Great Hall of Raston, as it had every year since the Compact's founding. It was a ceremony of formal accounting, debts assessed, stations confirmed, servants retained or released at the steward's word. The entire court attended. Foreign emissaries attended. Duke Osrin of the Eastern Duchy, a gray-faced man with small, careful eyes, attended for the first time in 3 years, seated in the guest gallery with a stillness that Marin, had she been watching him, might have recognized as the stillness of a man who already knows the result. She was not watching him. She was standing at the back of the hall in the servants' row, holding her hands folded at her waist the way Petra had taught her, watching the fires and waiting for the assembly to reach the kennel accounts. Sarath read the kennel entry himself. He rarely read servant entries himself. "The wolf-yard position," he said in the flat, carrying voice he used for formal proceedings, "has been reviewed this quarter and found redundant. The pack feeds and rests adequately under general kennel rotation. The specific tender post, occupied by the ward Marraine, daughter of the late kennel servant Kale, is hereby dissolved. The ward is dismissed from keep service effective at the close of this assembly, with standard charity provision of 2 nights' forest shelter and a half weight of grain." The hall did not react the way halls react in stories. There was no gasp, no visible protest from the assembled court. A few faces turned briefly toward the servants' row and then turned back. Petra, standing 2 places to Marin's left, made a sound that began as a word and was swallowed before it became one. Marin did not move for a long moment. She was aware of the fires, of the smell of tallow, of the specific weight of 200 people in a room all choosing not to look at her. Then she unfolded her hands and walked to the hall's side door and through it, because there was nothing else the situation permitted. She had her coat. She had the half weight of grain, delivered to the outer gate by a junior hall servant who did not meet her eyes. Petra had pressed a folded cloth into her hands at the gate, and inside the cloth were dried frost moss bundles tied with kennel cord and a small quantity of bone chalk wrapped in waxed paper, the materials of old kennel medicine that Petra kept in the locked box under her sleeping shelf. "In case of sickness," Petra had said, and had said nothing else because Sarath's door ward was watching, and Petra still had her own post to protect. Marin walked east through the frozen outer yard and into the black pine forest beyond the keep's boundary stones. She made camp at the forest's edge, close enough to see the keep's eastern tower through the trees. She ate sparingly. She waited without knowing what she was waiting for. The first 3 days the wolves did not concern her, because wolf behavior across 3 days of transition could mean many things. On the 4th day, a hall page she recognized came to the forest's edge and called for her without crossing the boundary, and told her that the pack had refused every handler since the first morning, and that Steward Sarath had ordered the feeding rotation doubled and the troughs filled twice daily, and the wolves had not approached them. She thanked the page and he left quickly, clearly unsettled by the errand. On the 6th day, Petra came herself, in the early dusk, and they sat together on a fallen pine, and Petra told her what she had observed. The 40 wolves were gathering at the eastern wall each evening at the 17th bell, the hour they had always been fed. They were not pacing with hunger. They were sitting in a line with their muzzles pointed east, toward the forest, and they were silent in the way that was worse than howling. 2 handlers had been bitten when they attempted to force the feeding. Sarath had brought in an outside pack handler from the lower village, and that man had lasted 1 day before asking to be released from the commission. "Something else," Petra said, and her voice had gone quieter than her usual quietness. "The king." She told Marin what she knew in pieces, because she had assembled it in pieces from fragments of hall gossip and the observations of the fire tenders who worked near the upper corridor. Aldrich had been unwell since before the assembly. Not the visible unwellness of injury, which the court would have seen and named, but a slow depletion, a fading of the particular stillness that made him feel dangerous even at rest. He had missed the morning assessments twice. He had sent his senior advisor to sit in his place at the evening fire council. His personal attendant had been forbidden to speak of it, but the fire tenders talked, and what they described was a man sleeping for hours longer than he should, waking without appetite, whose eyes in the corridors were focused somewhere past the walls of the keep. Marin listened to all of this and was quiet for a long time. The pines moved above them in the cold wind off the Threll. "The Pack King bond," she said finally. Petra nodded. It was old lore that kind Sarath's official kennel ledger had never recorded. The castle wolves of Vraston were not merely the keep's guard animals. They had been bonded to the Vraston throne through 4 centuries of ritual tending, a living thread between the Pack King's vitality and the health of the wolves under his roof. When the wolves were distressed, the king's body registered it. When the king's body faltered, the wolves felt it in their blood. Her father had known this. Petra had watched her father work with this knowledge for 20 years. The bond moved in both directions. If the wolves were refusing to eat and the king was failing, it was not 2 separate problems. On the 7th day, Marin found the print in the snow at the forest's edge, a single wolf print, too large for any of the younger animals, with a slight drag in the left rear that she recognized because she had watched the wolf who made it favor that leg for 2 winters. She followed the print line and found Ash, the pale female, lying on her side in the snow 30 yards inside the tree line, breathing shallowly, her left flank darkened with something that was not mud. She was a long way from the keep's boundary stones. She had come through the snow to find her. Marin crouched in the snow beside the wolf for a long time without touching her, letting Ash register her scent and her breath and the specific quality of her stillness. Then she put her hand on the wolf's rib cage and felt the wrong rhythm there, the shallow percussion of a body burning through its reserves. Something moved behind Ash's eyes at the touch, a recognition that preceded any decision, and the wolf's breathing slowed by a fraction. Marin carried her back to camp with Petra's help. That night, while Petra kept her hands on Ash's flanks and fed her small pieces of dried meat from her coat pocket, Marin thought about the water channel. The castle wolves drank from a stone channel that ran along the eastern wolf yard, fed from the keep's upper cistern. She had cleaned that channel herself every quarter month for 6 years. She knew the smell of the water in it the way she knew the smell of the wolf yard at different hours, intimately, with the specific knowledge of someone who has spent years paying attention to something no one else thought worth attention. When Petra had described the wolves gathering at the eastern wall each evening, she had described them sitting with their muzzles down, not raised. Wolves in distress from hunger raised their muzzles. Wolves sitting with muzzles down, in that particular still line, were doing something else. They were not hungry. They were sick. She needed to see the water channel. The need was specific enough to override the sense of danger that the keep's walls still held for her. She waited until the second night bell, when the outer ward's torch rotation left the eastern corner unwatched for 20 minutes. She left Petra with Ash and went in through the gap in the boundary stone wall that she had known since she was 11, that Sareth's guards had never found, because Sareth had stopped walking the eastern yard himself a decade ago. The wolf yard was empty of wolves and full of their absence, which was a different kind of presence. She went directly to the stone channel and crouched at the edge and held her palm near the water's surface without touching it. The smell came to her immediately. Cold stone, mineral sediment, the faint, sweet rot note of ashvale root dissolved in cold water. She knew the smell of ashvale root from Petra's locked box, where a small sealed portion was kept for the specific use of managing infected wounds in the wolf's paws, used in tiny quantities because in larger quantities, it was slow poison to any wolf-blooded creature. Someone had put ashvale root into the cistern feed. The quantity needed to dose 40 wolves across 7 days, she understood immediately, was not an accident of contaminated drainage. It was a careful, patient administration. She followed the channel to its upper junction with the cistern feed pipe and found the residue there. A cloth packet, emptied, lodged in the pipe's join, still carrying the ashvale smell. She took it with her. On her way back through the eastern corridor, she passed the door to the steward's outer records room, and she noticed, because she was a person who noticed specific things, that the door's seal was broken. The wax impression cracked and repressed in a way that was meant to look undisturbed, but was not. She did not go in. She noted it and moved on, because she had a more urgent task. She needed to reach the king. The upper corridor attendant rotation she also knew, because servants who have spent years in a keep learn its rhythms the way wolves learn the wind. She reached Aldrich's chamber door at the third night bell and found it closed but unguarded, the senior attendant apparently dismissed for the night. She stood at the door for a long moment listening to her own steadiness, and then she opened it and went in. The chamber was very large and very cold, the fire banked to coals, the air carrying the specific edge of a room where windows have been left partially open too long. Aldrich lay on the bed in the far corner, and what she saw stopped her 2 steps inside the door. She had seen the king at assembly and at the formal wolf yard inspections he conducted twice yearly, standing at the edge of the yard while she and Petra led the pack through their paces. He was a large man with the particular economy of movement that belonged to people who have been the most dangerous thing in every room they have entered for so long that they no longer need to demonstrate it. He had a scar along his left jaw that she had always noted without staring at, and his eyes in the wolf yard inspections had never settled on her for longer than the half-second required to confirm that she was a servant performing her function. He did not look like that now. He lay on top of the bed's outer covering without having drawn it over himself, and his breathing had the same wrong rhythm she had felt in Ash's ribcage, shallow, burning through reserves. His hands were open at his sides, and there was sweat at his temples despite the cold in the room, and his eyes, when they opened at her entry, did not focus on her immediately. When they did focus, the stillness that came into his face was not anger. It was something she had no name for and did not try to name. She moved to the bed and crouched beside it and said, very quietly, "I know what is making you sick. I have what I need to treat it. I need you to let me work." He looked at her for a long moment, and she felt something move behind his eyes that was not the recognition of a servant, and felt too the confusion she always felt when a powerful person looked at her as if she were something other than small, and set the confusion aside. He said, "You came back." She said, "I came for the wolves." He closed his eyes. A single clause registered in whatever part of him was still fighting through the fog. Not dismissal, then. She had come. She worked through the remainder of that night, grinding frost moss and bone chalk by the coal's light, mixing them with the proportions Petra had pressed into her memory through years of kennel teaching. Frost moss cleared the ash veil's binding to the blood. Bone chalk slowed the degradation that the ash veil had already caused. Together in the right measure, they were the counter-compound that old kennel medicine had used for centuries, before Sarath's ledger revision had stripped the knowledge from official record. She did not second-guess the proportions. She had made the compound before, for a wolf that had gotten into a contaminated drainage pool 3 winters ago, and she knew what she was doing. She stayed the first night and was gone before the morning bell. She came back the second night through the same gap in the wall. Aldrich was sitting up when she entered, which was progress, and his eyes found her immediately, which was more. He did not ask her why she had come again. He watched her grind and measure and mix with the particular attention of a man who has been in command long enough to recognize competence when he sees it operating, and said nothing until she had finished the preparation and handed him the clay cup. "The water channel," she said, and told him what she had found. She placed the emptied cloth packet on the table beside the cup. He picked up the packet and held it. Something moved in his jaw. "The steward's records room," she said. The seal was disturbed. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Osrin?" She did not ask him to explain. She had already understood that the scale of the Ashvale dosing was not a single person's capability, that sourcing that quantity of Ashvale root without court knowledge required a supply chain, and that a foreign duke with a 3-year absence who had arrived precisely at the Solstice Assembly had the specific combination of distance and access the scheme required. "Why my dismissal?" she said. It was not quite a question. To remove the one person in the keep who would identify the contamination. He put the cup down. He looked at the packet in his hand. And to give Osrin cause to call your presence here witchcraft. A dismissed servant found in the king's chamber is evidence of enchantment to anyone who wants it to be. She looked at him steadily. He looked back at her with the exhausted gravity of a man who has spent 7 years performing a certainty he no longer entirely feels, and she felt again the thing she had no name for and again set it aside. She left before the morning bell. The third night she came back to find him on his feet, dressed, standing at the partially open window looking out at the wolf yard below. Ash had returned to the keep that afternoon. Marin had learned from Petra, walking in through the main wolf yard gate on her own when a handler opened it for a delivery. The other wolves had met her at the gate and had let her through without aggression. And afterward all 40 had returned to the water channel and drunk from it for the first time in 8 days, because Marin had also spent part of the second day cleaning the channel and flushing the feed pipe, and removing every trace of what had been introduced there. Aldrich turned when she entered. He looked, she thought, like himself, or like the version of himself that existed before the ash veil had begun its work. The specific quality of contained danger had returned to his stillness. He said, "Sarath sent word to Osrin 2 hours ago. He told him you were in the keep." She processed this with the flatness of someone who has long known that safety is a thing that requires maintenance. "How long do I have?" "Osrin will table an accusation at the Solstice Final Council. Tomorrow, at midday." He looked at her with the particular intensity of a man choosing his next words with the care of a man who rarely has to choose. "He will call your presence here, enchantment. Sarath will confirm the dismissal, confirm your presence on the grounds after dismissal, and the council's Eastern Bloc will vote to make the accusation formal. Under the Compact's 16th provision, a formal accusation of enchantment against the Pack King is answered by immediate public execution." The word landed in the cold room like a stone into ice. Marin was quiet for a long time, longer than she might have been, because she was not thinking about herself. She was thinking about Petra, who had given her the frost moss and the bone chalk, knowing full well what Sarath might decide to call it. She was thinking about the kennel ledger, where her father's name appeared in the small reduced font of a man whose post had been made to vanish. She was thinking about 40 wolves, lined up at the eastern wall with their muzzles down, waiting for the person the keep had decided did not count. "Go back to the forest," Aldrich said. She looked at him. "Tonight," he said. "Before the council convenes. You will be safe in the trees. Osrin cannot extend a compact provision to territory outside the walls." She understood what he was offering. She also understood what she was about to say, and said it. The ledger in Sarath's records room. My father's entry. If I leave tonight, it will never be corrected. Sarath will destroy what is there before you can reach it, and the position he erased will remain erased, and the next wolf tender will know nothing of the channel and the bond lore and the specific names of 40 animals. And in 7 years, or 10, this will happen again. He was very still. "I am not offering you a trade," she said carefully. "I am telling you what will be lost. You can decide what to do with that." The silence in the room stretched out until it had weight and texture. Then Aldrich said, in a voice that was very quiet and very flat, "Stay in the castle until the council convenes. Do not be visible. I will need what you found in the channel." She gave him the cloth packet she had kept and left him standing at the window. The Solstice Final Council convened at midday in the Great Hall, under the full ceremony of the Compact's governing ritual. Banners, formal seating, the Fire Council elders in their robes, the foreign guests at the guest tables, the assembled court in the surrounding galleries. Duke Osrin sat at the Eastern Bloc table with 4 of his accompanying lords, and a studied expression of patience that Marin, watching from the gallery's shadow, recognized as the face of a man who believes the verdict is already decided. Sarath opened the council with the formal account of Marin's dismissal, the discovery of her presence in the keep after dismissal, and the placement of the accusation under Provision 16. He spoke clearly and evenly and did not look toward the gallery. He was a careful man who had spent many years being carefully wrong about what was permanent. Osrine seconded the accusation in the formal language of the compact's Eastern interpretation. The wolf tender's dismissal had been lawful. Her return was unauthorized. The king's illness during her absence and recovery after her clandestine attendance constituted, in Eastern precedent, a pattern of deliberate enchantment against a pack king. He called for immediate judgment. The hall was full of the specific silence of a large assembly waiting to see which way the most powerful thing in the room would move. Aldrich came through the hall's main doors at that moment. He did not come alone. His 2 senior council wolves flanked him, and behind them came the keep's fire council captain and 2 attending lords. And behind all of them, through the doors that had been left open to the outer corridor, the first of the 40 wolves entered the hall. Large, pale, moving without sound on the stone floor, and then the second, and then the third, and the assembly that had been silent became more silent in a different way, the way of a room that has registered something it was not prepared for, and has not yet decided what to do. Ash walked to the front of the column and stopped at Marin's side of the hall, muzzle down, ears forward. Aldrich crossed the floor to the council table and placed the emptied cloth packet on the table's surface, in the center, where everyone could see it. Then he placed beside it a folded letter bearing a broken seal that Marin recognized, even from the gallery, as the wax impression of the steward's records room, the one that had been cracked and repressed on the night she had observed it. Ashvale Root, he said. The hall was so quiet that the word reached every corner. Administered to the castle wolf pack through the cistern feed pipe over a period of no fewer than 7 days, sourced from a supply originating in the Eastern Duchy and delivered under the cover of the Solstice Assembly's provision shipment. He looked at Osrine with the steadiness of a man who has had 3 days to prepare this moment and has not rushed it. The letter is the commission. The steward's seal is on the commission. The Duke's reply is attached. Osrine studied patience fractured at the seams. Sarath stood from his chair, and the words he began did not have time to become a sentence before Aldrich spoke over them. Sit down. Sarath sat. The specific authority in 2 syllables from that man was not something the body easily argued with. Aldrich turned to the Fire Council elders. He spoke for 7 minutes, in the measured formal language of compact adjudication, and what he laid out was complete. The timeline of the Ashvale's introduction, Sarath's dismissal of Marin coinciding precisely with the point at which the contamination's effects would have become visible to an experienced wolf tender, the cloth packet's recovery from the feed pipe, the letter's contents commissioning the Ashvale supply from Osrine's duchy 3 months before the assembly. He named each element once, and did not repeat it, or elaborate beyond what the evidence required. The Fire Council elder Reth, the eldest of the 4, asked who had identified the Ashvale contamination and prepared the counter-compound. Aldrich said, "The keep's wolf tender." Reth looked toward the gallery, where Marin stood in the shadow at the rail. His gaze was not unkind. "The dismissed ward?" "No," Aldrich said. He turned then, fully, and looked up at the gallery, and the hall turned with him, and every face in the assembly found her at once. She stood very still under the weight of it. The head wolf-keeper of Rastan, her father held that post before Sarath dissolved it. The post was dissolved without council authorization, which is a violation of the compact's 9th provision. The ledger entry restoring Cale's record and naming his successor has been written. The council's confirmation is required. The elder Reth looked at Aldrich for a long moment. "The king is making a formal nomination before council?" "I am," Aldrich said. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Reth looked again at the gallery. He looked at the 40 wolves arranged along the hall's walls and center aisle with the specific quality of animals that have chosen where to be. He looked at the letter on the table and the cloth packet beside it. He said, The accusation under Provision 16 is dismissed for want of standing. The nominated post will be entered. He paused. The council will hear the matter of the steward. What followed took an hour, in the formal language of compact adjudication, and at the end of it Sarath stood stripped of his rank and bound at the wrists with keep cord in the hall where he had read Maren's dismissal, and Duke Osrin and his 4 attending lords had been placed under the Fire Council's holding authority, pending the Eastern Duchy's formal response to the Treason Commission. Osrin had attempted, at one point in the proceedings, to appeal to the foreign guest precedent and argue the council lacked jurisdiction. The Fire Council Elder Vanta, who had not spoken during the main proceedings, looked at him with a very dry and specific expression and said that the Eastern Duchy's ambassador would be notified and that the Duke would remain in holding until he arrived. Marin had come down from the gallery during the proceedings, because the way she moved through the hall's floor could not be indefinitely delayed without its own kind of statement. She stood now at the edge of the central floor, near Ash, with her hands folded the way Petra had taught her. Aldrich crossed the hall to where she stood. She was aware of every person in the room watching him move. She was aware of the particular quality of silence that had settled over the assembly, which was the silence of people who understand they are watching something they will describe later, in detail, to people who were not present. He stopped in front of her. He was tall enough that she had to look up to meet his gaze, and his eyes, which she had only seen at distance before, were the dark amber of pine resin in winter firelight. Then he went to one knee on the stone floor of the great hall. She did not expect it. She had expected words, a formal statement in the compact's language, a nomination confirmed. She had not prepared herself for a king on his knee on the cold flagstone looking up at her with the specific gravity of a man who has made an irrevocable decision and intends to be fully present for it. "Marin," he said, "daughter of Kale, head wolf keeper of Vraston, and by the Pack King's right of recognition, Luna of this keep and every territory under its compact." He spoke without looking away from her face. "What I owe you is more than this hall and this moment can hold. This is only the beginning of its accounting." She looked down at him and felt the thing she had been setting aside for 3 nights fill up the available space in her chest without her permission, and felt too the specific quality of her own steadiness, which had been the constant throughout, and was still there, underneath everything else. "Get up," she said quietly. "The wolves are watching." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile. It was the specific relaxation of a face that has been very controlled for a very long time, allowing one small muscle to do what it wanted. He rose. He stood at her side, not behind her and not in front of her, at her side, and turned to face the assembly. The Fire Council Elder Reth lowered himself to one knee. Elder Vanta followed. The attending lords behind Aldrich knelt one by one, the sound of each knee on the stone floor landing in the silence like a measured bell. The court in the gallery bowed in a wave, and the foreign guests at the tables, uncertain of the ritual, but certain enough of the room's gravity, rose and inclined their heads. Ash, the pale female, lay down on the flagstone at Marin's feet and put her muzzle on her forepaws. The 39 other wolves of Vraston settled around the hall's perimeter in the same posture, all at once, as if a single current had run through them. Petra was found at the kennel door when the assembly dispersed, because Petra had not been permitted into the hall for the proceedings, her status not rising to the formal attendance list, and she had spent the hour of the adjudication sitting on the cold step outside the kennel entrance with her hands folded on her knees and her lips moving without sound. The Fire Council captain who found her there told her it was done, and the ward was well, and Petra pressed both knotted hands over her eyes and wept without sound, the way she did everything, with great feeling and no dramatics. Marin came to her an hour later and they sat together on the kennel step, as they had sat many times before, not saying much because they had the kind of long familiarity that did not require it. Petra had brought a pot of heated barley and 2 clay cups, and they drank it while the afternoon's cold settled in around them. In the days that followed, the council confirmed the restoration of Cale's post and the full entry of his service record in the keep's main ledger. His name appeared in the larger column, the one reserved for heads of station, corrected and dated, taking up the space that had always belonged to it. Beside his name, in the succession column, the clerk entered Marin's name in the same hand. Sarath was removed to the Compact's holding settlement in the northern reaches under the terms of his stripped sentence, escorted by 2 of the Fire Council's guard. He left in the early morning before the keep was fully awake, which was the practical decision of a man who had spent 20 years understanding exactly what rooms could be made to forget him. Duke Osrin's ambassador arrived from the Eastern Duchy a week later and spent 4 days in careful negotiation with the Fire Council. The Duke was ultimately escorted home under a condition of formal exile from Vraston's territory, which was a softer outcome than the Treason Commission warranted, but was the outcome the Eastern Duchy's political stability could sustain without fracturing the Compact's Eastern membership. Elder Vanta, who had managed the negotiation, described it to Marin afterward as satisfactory with reservations, and Marin, who had not been present for the negotiation and had not been asked to be, understood that some tallies were settled over time and some were settled in an hour. And the important thing was that they were settled. The 40 wolves ate on the morning after the council's close, all of them, from the stone troughs that Marin filled at the 17th bell as she had always filled them. She moved through the wolf yard in the early dusk, naming each of them in the low, carrying voice she had developed over years. Ash, Bren, the 4 autumn pups who still startled at sound, old gray Corvel with his slow left rear leg, all 39 others in their order. The wolves came to the troughs one by one in the way that was not obedience, but something older and more mutual, the recognition of a relationship neither side had ever needed to formalize. She heard Aldrich's step on the yard's stone path when he was still 20 feet away, because she had learned in 3 nights of proximity to recognize the specific weight and rhythm of it. She did not look up from filling the last trough. He stopped at the yard's edge and was quiet. She had learned in those same 3 nights that he did not always say things immediately, that he waited for the right weight of sentence, and then spoke it without decoration. "The ledger is corrected," he said. "Your father's entry is in full." She looked up then. He was standing with his hands loose at his sides, and his scar caught the last gray light from the west, and his eyes on her had the specific quality she had spent 3 nights learning to read as something other than danger. "I know," she said. "I saw it this morning." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I did not ask you to stay." "No," she agreed. "I am asking now." She looked at him for a long time, in the way of someone who has learned not to take a thing at less than its exact weight. She thought of the specific catalog of what she knew about this keep, the water channel schedule, the wolves' 40 names, the gap in the boundary stone wall at the eastern corner, the smell of the cistern feed on a cold morning, the temperature of a room where a window has been open too long. She thought of Petra on the kennel step with her clay cup. She thought of her father's name, restored and legible, in the column where it had always belonged. She thought of a king on cold flagstone, looking up. "I have conditions," she said. The corner of his mouth moved again. The same small, specific relaxation. "Name them," he said. The wolf yard settled around them in the last of the day's light. The pack eating with the quiet, concentrated attention of animals returned to their right order, and the braziers threw a warm and amber light across the stone walls of the keep, and the great gate of Raston stood solid and whole at the yard's far end, the cold air off the threll, carrying the smell of pine and iron and the clean mineral note of a water channel running clear. Ash raised her muzzle from the trough and looked east, toward the tree line where the black pines stood against the darkening sky, and then looked back at Marraine and settled.